In spring of 2024, we produced a video with 22 students from the University of Zurich.
Yet, historical records do not support this.
This is not the picture ancient Greek sources reveal.
Methodologically, all of this is very questionable.
The subject of this video is ancient Greek warfare, because it allows us to demonstrate why revisionism is actually necessary. Now, before we go to the comment section, we need to make one thing clear. Historical revisionism is a really misunderstood term. It is not the same as political revisionism. While the latter can be problematic, the former is an important way of updating our knowledge about the past. The need for historical revisionism becomes clear when we look at warfare in ancient Greece. For more than 100 years, it has been portrayed somewhat like this. At the center of Greek warfare was the hoplite, a heavy infantry soldier fighting in a tightly ordered formation called a phalanx. In battle, two solid blocks of hoplites met at an agreed time on an open flat field and clashed in a rugby-like shoving match. Both armies accepted the result as decisive, and neither pursued nor destroyed the defeated enemy. This is because hoplite warfare was agonal, which means it followed an unspoken set of rules, much like a Sunday afternoon's sports tournament. In this type of combat, formation drills, weapons training, and discipline were crucial, and troop types like skirmishers or cavalry were virtually irrelevant. This characterized all hoplite battles, from the emergence of the phalanx until the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. When the phalanx first appeared, it proved so effective that it revolutionized warfare and profoundly changed Greek society. This is because the phalanx consisted both of aristocrats and middle-class farmer citizens, who increasingly fought side by side as equals and had the same military duties. Being equal in military matters, they demanded political equality and participation, which ultimately led to democracy. That sounds credible, doesn't it? Well, what you see here are the core elements of the classical view of Greek warfare, known as the orthodox view. Since the 1980s, skeptical voices from the depths of university libraries have grown increasingly louder in their criticism of this perspective.
Look, what Orthodox scholars consider to be true often stands in stark contrast to what the sources actually tell us.
This is Dr. Roel Konijnendijk from the University of Oxford. He is what Orthodox scholars call a revisionist or heretic. Revisionists suggested an alternative view of Greek warfare, arguing that it was a pragmatic, results-oriented form of fighting.
Greek warfare was much more than just hoplite shoving matches. The Orthodox model is based on cherry-picking the sources, overemphasizing specific points, and even projecting material from the classical and the Hellenistic period back into the archaic.
Let's put it this way. By ignoring what the great German historian Reinhard Koselleck called the veto power of the sources, that is, by not considering primary sources that contradicted their theories, Orthodox scholars wrote history to fit their preconceived ideas of hoplite warfare. In this video, we will look at the core arguments of this debate to provide you with an overview of the debate itself, a glimpse into warfare in ancient Greece, and evidence of why historical revisionism is necessary. To achieve this, we will follow an overview used in a seminar we taught at the University of Zurich in spring of 2024. Throughout the video, some of the participants of this seminar will contribute the expertise they have acquired by providing critical information about the ancient primary sources they analyzed during the seminar. Please note, however, that we wrote the script. The content has no connection to the University of Zurich, and we are solely responsible for any potential mistakes. As usual, all our sources are listed in the description box. Before we continue, we want to thank everyone who made this project possible. Our students, first and foremost, but also the University of Zurich, especially Ricarda Schmid, Andreas Viktor Walser, Felix Meyer and Anne Kolb from the Department of Ancient History, and Martin and Joshua from the Digital Library Space. Without further ado, let's start at the beginning. The Orthodox view of Greek warfare goes all the way back to 19th century Germany, when a group of primarily Prussian scholars first characterized Greek warfare.
These German historians had their reasons to picture Greek warfare as a contest between citizen hoplites who fought simple rule-bound battles on level ground over limited stakes. This concept, known as hoplite warfare, became the foundation of 150 years of research, finally summarized and popularized by the American classicist Victor Davis Hanson.
In the 1980s and 90s, with revisionist voices growing louder, Hanson argued more fiercely for the orthodox view than anyone before him, merging all its elements into a single coherent story, which he called the Hoplite narrative. This narrative has shaped the current public perception of Greek warfare, as seen for example in pop media like Zack Snyder's 300 or Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Hanson's narrative begins with the emergence of the Phalanx. Like most orthodox scholars, he thinks this happened very suddenly. This is the first issue we want to address. On the left of our panel, near the 7th century BC, you find a man named Tyrtaeus.
Tyrtaeus is often cited as an authority on what fighting in this early period looked like, and Orthodox scholars have long believed that what he describes is effectively just the clash of hoplite phalanxes.
Tyrtaeus writes the Greeks fought behind, quote, broad shield, with mighty spear in their right hand, shield pressed against shield, helmet to helmet, breast to breast. This led many Orthodox historians to think that by the 7th century BC, Greek warfare revolved around the phalanx of heavy infantry. Again, it's important to remember that the phalanx, in the Orthodox view, consists solely of heavily armed melee fighters, equipped with spears and shields, so no throwing weapons, no bows, and no cavalry. If this formation existed in the 7th century BC, warfare must have changed radically between the times of Homer and the early Archaic, radically enough for it to be a Hoplite Revolution. According to Professor Fernando Echeverria of the University of Madrid, quote, this is where the trouble begins, end quote. Before we talk about the idea of a Hoplite Revolution, let's take a closer look at Tyrtaeus.
Who was Tyrtaeus anyway? Very little is known about him. He was an elegist, which means he wrote poetry. His words should therefore be taken with a grain of salt.
In addition, the texts by Tyrtaeus are so-called battle parentheses, compositions designed to motivate the men and glorify honorable death in battle. It was certainly not his intention to neutrally portray the fighting style of the time.
But we can't ignore the fact that Tyrtaeus mentions close order formations and praises coherence in battle. He literally sings of men standing shield by shield and shoulder by shoulder. However, to call this a phalanx is at least questionable.
A few lines later, he also writes, "You, light-armed men, as you crouch beneath a shield on either side, let fly with huge rocks and hurl your smooth javelins at them, standing close to those in full armor." This contradicts the idea of a phalanx of heavy infantry, as the lightly armed mingle with the heavily armed in the battle formation Tyrtaeus describes.
So in the end, the result is the same as if we ignore Tyrtaeus altogether. In all probability, the Hoplite phalanx did not exist in the 7th century BC.
But as always, things are more complicated. Archaeological finds confirm the presence of hoplites in the 7th century BC. Most notably, remains of hoplite equipment and several pieces of pottery, like the famous Kigi vase. So the question is not whether the hoplite as a heavy infantry soldier existed at the time, but whether the existence of hoplites unambiguously proves the existence of the phalanx. Now, why is this so relevant? Well, because this is at the heart of the Hoplite Revolution theory. In a nutshell, the idea of the Hoplite Revolution goes like this. Homeric warfare was a series of heroic duels fought by aristocrats in front of a largely uninvolved mass of supporters. At the beginning of the Archaic period, the emergence of the hoplite equipment known as the panoply, primarily a double-gripped shield called the aspis, changed this drastically. The aspis was rapidly adopted throughout Greece, at such an unprecedented speed that led Orthodox scholars to assume that the shield and the hoplite panoply were highly effective. They concluded that the aspis was only useful in a close-ordered formation, suggesting that the use of the aspis, and subsequently the phalanx, were superior to all other methods of warfare. In the Orthodox view, this was a very rapid process, beginning in the late 8th or early 7th century BC and finishing by 650 BC at the latest.
We revisionists are skeptical of such a sudden military transformation, and most fundamentally, we question whether there's anything about the panoply that requires these men to fight in these rigid battle formations, these phalanxes.
You see, Orthodox scholars see the existence of the panoply as proof of the phalanx's existence. because they think it was the only effective way to fight with this equipment. The Aspis shield had a double grip, meaning the left arm slid through a loop before gripping the handle. This, they argue, made it easier to control, because it could only cover a man's left half. Therefore, to be fully protected, each man needed a similarly armed comrade on his right. Hence, hoplites could only effectively use the Aspis in a phalanx. In addition, it was often argued that the sheer weight of the panoply made them heavy infantry in the true sense of the word. Extremely well protected, but ponderous, inflexible, and virtually useless when used alone. Revisionists like Fernando Echeverria think orthodox scholars fall prey to, quote, the bane of military history, technological determinism. In trying to validate their preconceived notion of a heavy infantry formation in the sources, they have put the cart before the horse, by inferring an entire type of soldier and the need for a specific form of warfare, despite a lack of direct evidence. Revisionists doubt that the panoply was really that heavy, and that the Aspis was really that restrictive.
Hoplites occasionally utilized the Aspis when climbing ladders and fighting on ships, which shows that the shield did not restrict them as much as is often assumed. This suggests that they could effectively use it in combat in contexts other than the phalanx.
In addition, Hans van Wees, professor of ancient history and an expert on Homeric and archaic warfare, pointed out that the restrictions of the double grip only apply to a soldier facing straight forward. When putting the left leg forward, the Aspis does cover the full body. So, all in all,
the phalanx likely maximized the hoplites' potential, but it is very unlikely that the hoplites could only fight efficiently in this formation.
if this is true, the whole orthodox argumentation of heavy cumbersome infantrymen fighting in the phalanx because this was the only way they could fight crumbles, and with it the idea of a military revolution in the early archaic period. But the idea of a hoplite revolution involves much more than changes to military tactics. Orthodox scholars claim that these military changes also had a tremendous impact on society. They argue that the new style of fighting necessitated making the phalanx as large as possible, which forced aristocrats to include anyone who could afford the equipment. In the phalanx, each man had to rely on the man next to him to hold the line. This must have created new values of equality based on group coherence, mutual support and equal rights and duties, which led to the emergence of a large middle class of warriors who wanted to participate in politics. When they weren't allowed to, they supported tyrants, absolute sovereigns, who seized power forcefully to break the existing order. Essentially, this argument goes back to Aristotle's Politics, a work written in the 4th century BC, about 300 years after the supposed Hoplite Revolution. Aristotle writes that the first constitutions and broader-based forms of governments came along when the hoplites grew in number, which allowed a significant part of the population to band together and break the military dominance of the old cavalry aristocracy. Again, revisionists oppose this.
Aristotle's Politics is a complex source that must be read and interpreted cautiously. Aristotle's reasoning is highly idealized, and he contradicts himself in places. Moreover, it is questionable whether there was a military revolution in the archaic period, and therefore whether military changes led to a political revolution. There certainly was a change, but it was probably not driven by the rise of hoplites.
Aristotle was a philosopher, not a historian. In his Politics, he not only reports on historical forms of government, but also reflects on an ideal state. Because Aristotle was at least in part theorizing, his Politics cannot be seen as clear proof that the adoption of the phalanx led to political change.
The question, then, is one of causality.
There certainly were social changes in ancient Greece. However, these changes were primarily due not to changes in warfare, but to changes in the economy and society as a whole.
So, apart from the fact that the phalanx couldn't have caused a political revolution, if it only became widespread at the end of the archaic or early classical period, revisionists point to the lack of evidence for a direct impact of the rise of the hoplite on politics. In the end, basing such a massive claim on the very theoretical work like Aristotle's Politics is at least questionable. But what could have happened instead?
Revisionists tend to argue for a much slower, more gradual transformation from Homeric to archaic and then classical warfare. The early infantry formations that we find in the poetry of Tyrtaeus or depicted on the Kiji vase were probably little more than sort of loosely organized ad hoc shield walls that provided protection for lighter armed skirmishers and possibly even men fighting on horseback. As the numbers of hoplites increased, this early, fluid, heroic form of warfare gradually faded away until these battle lines were formed almost exclusively of hoplites deployed in formations that we can identify as being several ranks deep and organized for battle.
This was probably still no neat rank-and-file formation as the Prussians had imagined, but there was less and less room for heroic, death-defying single combat. In all probability, the phalanx as we imagine it only began to take shape around the time of the Persian Wars. Despite all of this, the idea of a Hoplite Revolution isn't simply an invention by some old-fashioned scholars. After all, it is a theory based on ancient sources. Things went off track when they started to ignore contradictory information, filling in the gaps to create a seamless but simple image of Greek warfare. A story, or more precisely, a straightforward and understandable narrative, that only partially reflects what the ancient sources actually present. This becomes clearer with the next issue, one that is especially strange to neutral observers: the idea of fair war, or in technical terms, agonal warfare. The Greek word agon means conflict, struggle or contest, and can, for example, refer to a sports event like the Olympic Games. Supposedly, the Greeks settled their conflicts with a single decisive engagement between heavy infantry on level ground. Like an athletic competition, it followed a set of rules and was very fair. This was because the hoplites came from a land-owning middle class and tried to limit war-related destruction as much as possible to protect their property. Victor Davis Hanson wrote that, quote, "Hoplite infantry battle determined the very nature of Greek warfare and became the means to settle disputes instantaneously, economically and ethically." End quote. Up to the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, Orthodox scholars think battles were fought only on open level ground at an agreed upon time. The use of tactics was seen as unfair. This allegedly resulted in a way of fighting described, for example, by Herodotus.
Yet the Greeks, I hear, do wage war, and they do so senselessly in their poor judgment and stupidity. When they have declared war against each other, they find the finest, flattest piece of land and go down there and fight, so that the victors come off with great harm. I will not even begin to speak of the defeated, for they are utterly destroyed.
While this makes for an interesting story, I encourage you to look at the context of the quote. It does not support the orthodox narrative of agonal warfare, since it is part of a speech written by Herodotus, who used it as a vehicle for his own narrative. Herodotus' portrayal of the speech shows what an ambitious general and advisor to Xerxes could have said to encourage the invasion.
So these words were written by Herodotus, but spoken by a Persian trying to convince his great king to invade Greece.
He describes Greek warfare as agonal and unreasonable to show how easily they could be defeated. This statement is therefore a rhetorical device employed by Herodotus rather than a factual description of warfare practices. Using this as a proof of agonal warfare is highly questionable.
As our students did in this example, revisionists refuted much of the evidence for agonal warfare. One of the most vehement critics, Peter Krentz, also demonstrated that the ancient sources do not support the claim that single battles decided wars. If this had been the case, there wouldn't have been so many drawn-out conflicts with repeated engagements. Practical concerns further challenge this notion.
Actually, I went on a field trip to Greece some weeks ago and took these pictures. As you can see, there's not much flat ground. In many places, rugged coastlines transition directly into hilly or even mountainous terrain. Where, we might ask, did these fair fights on level ground take place?
Orthodox scholars obviously noticed this too, and framed it as one of the great paradoxes of Greek warfare. However, when revisionists critically re-examined the ancient sources, They noticed that in 2/3 of the battles of the classical period, one or both armies tried to deceive, surprise, or gain a terrain advantage.
Here's the thing, what the sources actually tell us is that the Greeks tended to avoid pitched battle on flat and open ground at all costs. Instead, one of the most common ways of attack was the surprise attack, to overwhelm an enemy when he was not expecting it, and this is pretty much the exact opposite of agreeing on a time and place to fight.
Greek generals were very aware of the different tactical options. They attacked and defended cities, blocked bottlenecks, raided enemy camps, and exploited the terrain. Clearly, Greek warfare was not limited to rule-bound battles. In fact, revisionists find no indication whatsoever that the ancient Greeks were willing to give away an advantage on the grounds of some moral code or unspoken set of rules. Because of this, they think that Greek warfare was never fair and ritualized, but in fact had been brutal and pragmatic all along. Now, to understand this properly, it is worth examining one illustrative issue, where the contrast between orthodox scholars and revisionists is more extreme than in any other: the end of battles. In the orthodox view, a battle was over when one side conceded. The victor would not pursue the loser and would not shed more blood, but rather accept the enemy's acknowledgement of defeat by allowing them the humble request to collect their fallen comrades. Victory was final, and the loser was treated fairly, according to the unspoken code of hoplite warfare. Rilke Nijendijk, like most revisionist scholars, has a markedly different opinion.
At this point, the bloodiest phase of a Greek battle began.
Again, the orthodox view isn't entirely without foundation. It is based on ancient sources. Most importantly, Thucydides informs us that the Spartans, quote, pursue their defeated enemy only briefly and not far. This fits the idea of agonal warfare perfectly.
But can we conclude from this that Greek warfare was fair and agonal, as Orthodox historians believe? The revisionists say no. Rather, Thucydides presents the Spartans as a special case, waging war in a manner unlike other Greeks.
This quote is from Thucydides' account of the First Battle of Mantinea, in which he repeatedly points to the peculiarities of Spartan warfare.
So, even if the Spartans did not pursue their enemies, it cannot be assumed that other Greeks followed the same approach. Moreover, refraining from pursuing an enemy is not necessarily an act of fairness. And if we look again at Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War, were there really no examples of pursuit? In fact, there are numerous examples of battles in which the losing side was chased and slaughtered, which clearly contradicts the concept of fair Greek warfare.
Revisionists confirm this for other primary sources and city-states. In fact, there are so many examples of pursuit and slaughter from all over Greece that most revisionists conclude it was the standard treatment of defeated armies.
The pursuit of fleeing enemies, it was so enthusiastically and universally carried out that we should really see this as the purpose of a pitched battle, the goal for which these men were fighting.
With the next issue, things get a bit more delicate. Bronze-clad elite warriors, marching in close lines, carefully coordinated and extremely disciplined, are only conceivable if every soldier was drilled in formation tactics and trained in weapon use. Now, Orthodox scholars simply assume they were, because it's the only way they could successfully fight in a phalanx. Here, determinism comes full circle. The Aspis shield requires hoplites to fight in a phalanx, and the phalanx requires hoplites to use an Aspis and train. But how, revisionists ask, did ordinary citizen levies become elite heavy infantry? They point out that there are no hints of regular formation drills outside Sparta, before Athens made a 2-year training known as ephebeia mandatory in 336 BC. A glimpse at our panel shows that this was almost 300 years after the supposed appearance of the phalanx. Before that, and without training, hoplites could hardly have functioned as disciplined infantry. The one exception to this was Sparta. Thucydides was awed by its army, and Xenophon tried to convince the other Greeks to train like them. So there must have been a significant gap between military training in Sparta and other city-states. But how much of a difference was there, really?
Xenophon's depiction of Spartan warfare should be taken with a grain of salt, because he was an admirer of Sparta. Therefore, he probably paints an idealized picture of the Spartan phalanx and tactics.
The aforementioned information on the Spartan army comes from the Constitution of the Spartans, which was intended as a didactic material to persuade other Greek cities
to adopt the Spartan model. Therefore, it is quite possible that Xenophon exaggerated the effectiveness and feasibility of Spartan tactics.
According to Xenophon, the pillar of Spartan success was a hierarchical organization. Spartan formations were divided into subunits, each led by an officer, so that in battle, almost an entire front rank consisted of officers.
We shouldn't think of the Spartan phalanx as a kind of high-tech, superpower organized army that completely obliterated their enemies in a Hollywood-worthy performance. We have Xenophon saying that their tactics were so easy to understand that no one who knows man from man can possibly go wrong.
Basically, it amounted to nothing more than leaders leading leaders. The men in the ranks toward the back could simply follow the men in front of them.
I mean, I've called the Spartans the proverbial one-eyed man in the land of the blind. They gained an advantage over other city-states simply by organizing their citizens, requiring them to exercise, and then drilling them in a few really basic maneuvers.
The fact that Xenophon thought this simple concept was worth advertising speaks volumes about the training elsewhere in Greece. So, if warfare wasn't agonal, and hoplites were mostly amateurs, what about the neat rank-and-file phalanx? Nothing illustrates better than a glance at the question of formation that Orthodox scholars tended to search the ancient primary sources for a phalanx as they imagined it. They had a clear vision of a heavy infantry formation, 8 ranks deep, orderly arrayed, and always led by the strongest contingent on the right wing. You see, most armies were made up by coalitions that each sent a number of soldiers. These usually fought together as city-state units, such as Spartans with Spartans, Athenians with Athenians, and so on. According to the Orthodox view, the best troops were deployed on the right wing, which was the most dangerous and most honorable position because there was no one to protect the right flank. This assumption comes from Herodotus' report about the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC. Because Sparta was the leader of the Greek alliance, they took the right wing, leaving the Tegeans and Athenians competing for the second and third position of honor on the left wing and the Spartans' left side.
Herodotus' account of this dispute over the most honorable positions in the phalanx initially seems to strengthen the Orthodox argument. Providing a detailed list of who received each position and why creates the impression of a clear hierarchy. However, the subsequent events cast doubt on this interpretation. The order was not strictly followed, but rather changed so that the Athenians, who had experience fighting the Persians, faced the strongest Persian contingents.
When the Persians saw this, they switched positions too, so the Greeks had to return to their initial deployment.
The formation therefore appears to have been somewhat flexible and based on practical and tactical considerations. This passage then should not be generalized and applied to all phalanges, but rather seen as one example among many.
Although it is unlikely that this switch of positions happened, remember there were thousands of men involved. This episode shows that positioning the best men on the right was not a principle set in stone. This is confirmed by the fact that out of 22 major battles of the classical period, where the commander's position is known, only a minority were stationed on the right wing. During his attack on Olynthus in 382 BC, for example, the Spartan commander Teleutias put himself and his best troops on the left wing, because he wanted to face the city gate, where he expected the most resistance. Because of this evaluation, revisionists think the best troops were placed on the right wing if no tactical considerations suggested otherwise. If they did, deployment followed practical considerations. The best hoplites, then, were placed where they were needed the most. So, while the sources are truly diverse, Orthodox scholars try to find patterns and standards. For example, they identified a standard depth of 8 ranks for phalanxes. Indeed, looking at the numbers of ranks the sources give us for battles in the classical period, 8 is the most common. But this is very misleading, as we only know the depth of about 20 phalanxes, out of hundreds of reported engagements. Scientifically speaking, this sample is much too small to represent a norm, even for the classical period. Projecting this supposed standard to the archaic is definitely a bad idea. Because the number of ranks reported by the sources varies significantly, revisionists think there was no standard. Instead, the depth of formations was also determined by practical factors. Think of this as a variable a general could change according to his battle plan and the circumstances. A wide phalanx was harder to outflank, while a deep one was harder to break. In this light, revisionists think of the phalanx not as a massed formation of well-drilled men, but simply as the best solution to deploy ill-trained levies. The primary sources present a picture of Greek armies resembling the shield walls of medieval peasant armies, not the disciplined heavy infantry formations we're used to think of. And in fact, this is probably what they were.
Greek soldiers were amateurs. They were unfamiliar with unit drill, they were untrained with their weapons in any formal way, and they were incapable of complex maneuvers.
If the phalanx wasn't a dense and disciplined formation of heavy infantry, we must also reconsider the role of other troop types. One primary source often quoted by Orthodox scholars to show that warfare was exclusively the business of hoplites, and that all other troops were negligible, comes from Thucydides. About skirmishers, he writes, quote,
"Their numbers are terrible to behold, and the volume of their shouting is unbearable, and there is a clear threat in the way they wave their weapons in the air. But when they come to grips with those who stand their ground, they are not what they seem."
In this passage, Thucydides reports a speech by Brasidas, a Spartan military leader who is fighting what the Greeks refer to as barbarians. Unlike the Spartans, the barbarians didn't rely on phalanx but on light and mobile skirmishes. Once again, context is key. Brasidas spoke to his men when they were outnumbered and surrounded in hostile territory. Considering this context, Brasidas' downplaying of the threat skirmishes posed seemed intended to boost his soldiers' morale in the face of real danger.
So, if we can conclude anything from this, it is that isolated hoplites were prone to attacks by more mobile troops. And indeed, this is what the primary sources show. In the Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC, for example, the Athenian general Demosthenes deployed light infantry skirmishers in small contingents. They wore the enemy Spartan phalanx down by attacking it from high points and retreating when the hoplites tried to get to them. When they suffered increasing losses, the Spartans lost courage and retreated. Much in the same way, the relatively slow hoplites often stood no chance against cavalry. Even in small numbers, mounted warriors could control a whole region and win or defeat an entire campaign. In 369 BC, for example, just 60 horsemen routed the rearguard of a large Argive army plundering their land. All in all, revisionists see no reason to believe that warfare in ancient Greece was exclusively the business of hoplites. Instead, they think of Greek armies as integrated forces and point to numerous sources attesting the usefulness of other troops. They agree that the phalanx formed the backbone of Greek armies because only hoplites could resist a direct charge and provide cover for other troops. However, they also think that phalanxes depended on light infantry and cavalry because they were vulnerable against skirmishers and flanking maneuvers. In the end, the evidence indicating that it was highly unusual to go to war without skirmishers and that battles were won because the enemy lacked cavalry or light infantry is simply overwhelming. By now, those of you who know their way around Greek warfare are surely wondering what's the deal with hoplite battles then. This question has captured significant attention and sparked heated discussions. Orthodox scholars imagine Greek warfare as battles decided by a shoving match between two masses of hoplites, with the front ranks trying to inflict damage with their spears while the men in the back push them forward to generate momentum. This shoving action, referred to as ophismos, literally pushing, has often been compared to the line of scrimmage in American football or a rugby scrum. This way of fighting has been questioned on both practical and theoretical grounds. From a practical perspective, it is not clear exactly how the number of men influence the strength of an attack. Recent experiments suggest that the weight of even just 3 or 4 rows pushing would make it difficult for the men in the front to keep their footing, let alone wield weapons effectively. From a theoretical perspective, not a single primary source from the archaic or classical period explains the depth of the phalanx as a way to increase its pushing power. But if revisionists think that the hoplite shoving matches were not a thing, how do they imagine battle in classical Greece? For one, they reject the idea of a standard battle that always follows the same rules. They think of warfare as messy, pragmatic, and diverse. Nevertheless, they highlight some recurring elements of Greek warfare. In a revisionist battle, the heavily armed but untrained hoplites formed the center, not because the phalanx was so effective, but because it was a sensible way to deploy an army of amateurs. The cavalry was probably on the flanks to protect the phalanx's vulnerable sides and outflank the enemy, or in front to lure the enemy into an attack. The skirmishers and light infantry were positioned either in front of the phalanx, behind it to shoot over it, or on the flanks. In addition, there was a reserve which stayed away until it saw a chance to decide the fight, or was needed to reinforce weakened parts of the formation. During the engagement, cavalry and light infantry often cancelled out their counterparts, and restrictive terrain limited the freedom of movement. The phalanx, hindered by a lack of training and the conditions of battle, not by some moral code, had only two basic tactical options: a straightforward charge or an outflanking maneuver. To compensate for this, Greek generals used small contingents of hand-picked men for specific, tactically important tasks, like cutting the enemy off from its reserve. One tactic that was used often was the cascading charge. In a cascading charge, the cavalry attacked the opposing force as first wave, followed by the light infantry as a second wave, the younger hoplites as a third wave, and finally the rest of the phalanx. Ancient Greek armies did not strive to win a symbolic victory, but to destroy the enemy in a ruthless display of military power.
Instead of following unspoken rules and fighting fairly, the Greeks tried to achieve victory but minimal risk to themselves. They relied on surprise attacks and ambushes and tried to manipulate the situation by any means they could. If a pitched battle in open ground happened, it was usually because all other options had been exhausted and there was no other way to bring the campaign to a satisfactory conclusion.
In addition, the defeat of the phalanx didn't end the conflict fairly and without further bloodshed. In fact, it did not even end the battle. The goal of warfare was not to, quote, settle disputes instantaneously, economically and ethically, end quote, but to deal a blow to the enemy's economic and human resources from which they would not quickly recover. Pursuit and slaughter were very real elements of Greek warfare. In 2008, Orthodox and Revisionist scholars held a conference at Yale to try to resolve the debate surrounding warfare in ancient Greece, or at least mediate talks. It was an utter failure. Instead of coming closer, each side further entrenched its position, going back and forth on specific aspects of the debate. So clearly, this issue is far from settled. Only recently, in 2021, Fernando Echeverría concluded that the Orthodox view is slowly losing ground in the academic world, but remains important. Outside academia, perceptions of Greek warfare are still dominated by the Hoplite narrative. The Hoplite narrative is attractive because it provides a clear and straightforward picture of the complex and obscure topic of ancient Greek warfare. The problem is that things aren't that simple. They never are. Because revisionists accept this and refrain from filling in gaps, they can't answer everything. Maybe just for now, maybe for good. This, however, is the only way to avoid incorrect generalizations. The revisionist view of Greek warfare certainly isn't beyond any doubt, but it does take the primary sources seriously, and is, therefore, closer to what they really present. All of this neatly shows that historiography is not simply a reflection of what happened. Instead, it is what historians think happened. That's the difference between history, the most probable interpretation of the past, and the actual past. History, unfortunately, is biased, contains misunderstandings, and can be exploited for ideological goals. As in the case of hoplite warfare, consciously or unconsciously, a model based on a selective reading of sources, and the reprojection of 19th century military experience and education can shape and dominate our perception of the past for centuries. This is precisely why history needs revisionism. It is essential to understand academic literature in the historical context of its time. We should not simply take what scholars wrote years ago for granted, but critically scrutinize their findings again and again, and re-examine the primary sources they used. Only then can we slowly work toward the most probable interpretation of the past.